Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. We are still waiting all the attendees to join the event. But let me kick off the webinar that we're organizing today that is entitled Financing for Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Daniele Fattibene, and I'm working as research fellow at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. I'm also coordinating the European Think Tanks Group, a network of the 6 most leading think tanks dealing with development cooperation in Europe. I am very pleased to chair this event, but let me start by thanking all those people who made this possible. So first and foremost, our friends and colleagues from the International Training Center of the ILO in Turin, who have very enthusiastically supported us in this journey. My colleagues Elisabeth and Luca, who made the organization possible in the past weeks. My colleague Maria Brozu from the European Think Tanks Group, and of course the Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation, who supported us in this webinar's organization. Let me also thank all the speakers that have accepted our invitation. We have a very distinguished group of panelists coming from all over the world. This is a very global event. Just 2 rules for all the attendees for the game. This event is being recorded and it will be posted on IAI's social media channels in the next days. You can use during the Q&A session the Q&A function in the Zoom platform. So we kindly invite you all to do that, to make this event as much lively as possible. And now I will just kick off the event by welcoming the speakers of the first part for all the welcome remarks. So I'm giving the floor now to first Director Giuseppe Casale, Director of the Interim of the International Training Center of the ILO, followed by Vincenzo Fucci, Research and Program Officer at the ITC Center of the ILO. And then I will pass the floor to Nicolò Russo Perez, International Relations Coordinator of the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo, and to my colleague Nicoletta Pirozzi, who is head of the EU Politics and Institutions Program, and also Institutional Relations Manager of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. So with no further ado, we'll give the floor to Director Casale and Vincenzo for their remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniele. And of course, a warm welcome to all of you, panelists and participants to this webinar. When this was proposed as initiative by the Istituto Affari Internazionali, I immediately jumped on it because I think that the topic is extremely important, especially, I would say today more than yesterday, for the simple reason, as you can imagine, that we are living in a deep crisis which has to do not only for the economic, I will call it setbacks because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but in particular, I would say from a social point of view. We are all living this pandemic in a different way, where inevitably the inequalities have emerged more strongly than ever, and the tragedy that we see from our own observatory of the ILO is that this inequality is not only between regions, as usually expected, north and south or east and west, but is also within the same country and also within the same region. So this is a plea from us who are working with the ILO to find a way out and to make sure that we can build back the economies from the dramatic impact of COVID-19. Now, just to give you the latest figures which have been published by the World Employment Report of the ILO, which has been released a few months ago, we have estimated that the global loss of labor income in the first 9 months of 2020 is about 3.5 trillion US dollars. And of course, this is a gigantic loss for the entire global governance, for the entire global economy. And the problem is that we know that there are too many countries in the world, too many regions in the world which were already, I would say, underdeveloped, which will find themselves even more in a difficult situation to come back to the whatever was the situation before 2019. So we are dealing with a situation with higher unemployment, with an incident, of course, increase in poverty, as I mentioned before, inequality, and all this brings inevitably to social tensions. So the ILO, and then I will rather leave the floor to Vincenzo, just because I wanted to kick off the ball, is practically the ILO not only needs to stand over for the two major, I would call it, major action of promoting social justice on the one hand, and also promoting the decent work agenda, because we are living in a deep deficit in fulfilling the criteria of decent agenda. But the ILO should and continue with all its member states to advocate a social and economic response, which goes in one way hand in hand with the achievement of the 17 goals of the 2030 agenda. And this can be done by stimulating the economy and employment. As you can imagine, without growth and without jobs, there should be no future for the next generation. Supporting enterprises, jobs and income, extremely important, especially for those who are living outside the labor market and found extremely difficult to go back into the labor market. Protecting workers at the workplace, because this is part of our main mandate. And finally, to restore that necessary level of dialogue between the major stakeholders, between the major social partners and government representatives, in order to finally find a consensus on what to do in order to reach out the majority of the population. Now, the situation definitely is difficult, but it's not without a solution. And this is probably, I think, the webinar of today, with many of you intervening and bringing also the findings of your recent research, but also forward-looking in the short and long term, could be definitively a plus for all those who are following us. And in particular, I would like to say a welcome to our students in our masters. We have in particular a master on social innovation, who is practically coordinated by Vincenzo, who are attending this webinar today. And through them, we may find even further solution on how to go about it. I thank you once again to all of you. Thank you the Fondazione, thank you the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and also many thanks to my colleague and friend Jafar, who has accepted to be part of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director. Thank you so much. Vincenzo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Daniele, and thanks, Director Casale, and obviously also thanks to IAI for organizing this event and for having us here today. well, as an ITCL officer, in my very short intervention, just would like to highlight two different topics. On one hand, the link between the ILO mission, the financial sector, and sustainable development. And on the other hand, also how both the ILO and our center, the ITCLO, have been aligning their strategies with these new emerging themes. Well, with regard to the UN, the ILO mission and the ILO role in the promotion of sustainable development and sustainable development as a topic, we can talk about an open coalition between them, between the UN Labour Agency and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Indeed, still today, access to jobs remain one of the most important priorities at the global level when we talk about development and most of all when we talk about sustainable development, and especially when it has been accentuated the quality aspect of labor. Decent work today means not only meeting the aspiration of people in their working lives, but also guaranteeing them labor outcomes, safe workplace, effective social protection, but also the same opportunities for all women and men. And that's why today we can say that decent work is one of the linchpin, not only of social justice, but also of the social dimension of sustainability. And that's also why this concept has been embedded in the major UN resolution, including the most important plan of action adopted to achieve sustainable development, which is the 2030 Agenda. Well, the SDG number 8, which calls for sustainable and inclusive economic growth, full and productive employment, and obviously decent work with all its targets, is perfectly in line with the parameters and the benchmarks set in the ILO Decent Work Agenda. And the ILO that in the achievement of this goal plays one of the fundamental role, a guiding role, on his end as identified in the social impact finance, one of the most important enabler to contribute to decent work. The motivations behind this increasing interest by the ILO in the financial sector are various. First of all, the socioeconomic pressures deriving from the 2008 financial crisis, but also the disruptive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the resulting inability of both market and states on their own to face with these challenges, and also the complexity of the new challenges in the horizon, especially in light of the fourth industrial revolution. And I will also mention, last but not least, also the emergence of new economic patterns, such as that of social and solidarity economy, but also the emergence of new social actors, especially from the third sector. Well, all these factors have shed light on the need for a new innovation paradigm, especially in the financial sector. And that's why the ILO responses have resulted in various initiatives, among which I just would like to mention the social finance program launched by the ILO. Well, this program recognizes, on one hand, the important role to be played by the financial sector in the world of work, but on the other hand, it's also promotes the engagement of different stakeholders, from banks, credit unions, but also microfinance institutions, and obviously investors in this new emerging area. This program that rests on three fundamental aspects of the financial sector, which are the financial inclusion, the insurance facility, and obviously all the investments needed to in the decent and sustainable work. And also our center, the ITCLO, in accordance with this new course launched by the ILO, has responded to this, let's say, this new call for educating social and political actors, policymakers, but also practitioners to these new social finance practices. And that's why the learning path of the training program of the center, but especially that of our master program at the Turin School of Development, such as the case of the Master in Social Innovation for Sustainable Development, but also that in Management of Development. This learning path is increasingly aimed at encouraging financial actors and socio-political agents to cultivate these new models of financial sustainability. Well, just to conclude, I would like also to mention one of the latest initiatives held by the Social Finance Department of the ILO and the ITCLO, which is the training course entitled Financing for Decent Work, which is intended to provide new skills and new knowledge to engage in national consultation on SDG finance, but also to carry out avant-garde national financing strategies. So looking forward to hearing from these high-profile speakers, and thanks once again to the IAI for organizing this event and having us here today.
Thank you so much, Vincenzo. We will have the chance also with you in the second panel to, dig more into the topics that you have already anticipated. But first, let me give the floor to Nicolò Russo Perez for his welcoming remarks, and then to Nicoletta for her speech as well.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Daniele, and welcome to all of you. Welcome to all the participants. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Nicolò Russo Perez. I'm in charge of the international affairs activities with the Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo. We are a private foundation, actually one of the largest private foundation operating in Italy and in Europe. And one of the few, I must say, in Italy with a quite relevant international projection and profile. What we do at the international level, we try to support activities that span from policy-oriented research, outreach activities, and training. And I think today's event is a good example of how we combine these three elements in one shot, if I might say. In terms of strategy, we try to connect some of our strategic partners, like the Istituto Affari Internazionali. So thanks a lot to our friends with the IAI, with some of the local international institutions that are based here in Torino. So thanks to the Giuseppe Casale, to the director of the International Training Center of the ILO, but also thanks to Jafar Javan from the United Nations System Staff College. We have a huge campus, United Nations campus here in Torino, which is a key partner of the international activities of the Compagnia di San Paolo. In terms of topics, we try to be at the international level as a private player foundation. We try to be aligned with the, let's say, broader posture of the foreign policy of Italy. So we have a strong focus on European affairs, a strong focus on the, let's say, transatlantic dimension, so the transatlantic bond, and a strong focus also on the, let's say, geopolitical dimension of the Mediterranean. Today's event, and I look very much forward to the conversation and to understanding more and learning more from the expert that will join us today, is a key topic also for the private sector, because increasingly we see as a private sector representative that there is a need to align both the institutional activities with the Sustainable Development Goals parameter, but also the investment policy with the so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So we try to use this lens increasingly in order to implement our activities. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Nicoletta Pirozzi, a colleague from the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and thanks a lot to all of you for joining us today. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicolò. Good morning, everybody. I will also be very brief to give the chance to the speakers to start the real conversation of today. Just to say from my side that this is really a very good opportunity for us, for the Institute for International Affairs, to get together with our partners in Turin, and first and foremost with the Compagnia di San Paolo Foundation, but also the International Training Center of the ILO, and to connect them with our partners at the European level, in particular our partners of the European Think Tanks Group, which is a network to which we belong since a few years ago now. This event offers a chance also to present a collective study that was conducted in the framework of the European Think Tanks Group on how public development banks can include the SDGs countries and the targets of the UN Agenda 2030 in their operations. This study has been already presented in October 2021 during the second edition of the Financing Commons Summit and was sponsored by the French Agency for Development. So today the main findings of the study will be presented by our ETTG partner Damian Barshish from IDRI. And I think it is particularly timely and also very important that we manage to gather key speakers from the research community, representatives of public development banks such as Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, multilateral development banks such as the African Development Bank Group, and also key international partners of YAI such as the T20 Indonesia and the OECD Development Center. On the content, I mean, the speakers will talk extensively about it, but just to say that even before the COVID-19, we have witnessed a mismatch between the stated ambitions of the Agenda 2030 and the mobilization of adequate financing for this purpose. This SDG financing gap in developing countries has increased even more in 2019 and 2020, 50% in 2019, and even more in 2020. And in this context, we notice that least developed countries are struggling to mobilize the adequate resources, but also to monitor and coordinate them. So, and also to align the SDG financing with the national development strategies of these countries. Therefore, I think the first aim of this seminar will be to assess what kind of innovative financing mechanisms can be mobilized to finance these challenges, and also how to effectively engage global actors to ensure this sustainable transition that leaves no one behind. With this, I pass the floor to Daniele. I really look forward to listen to our conversation today.
Thank you so much for all your welcoming remarks. And again, thank you for being here. And now we'll just kick off the panels with the presentation of the study just mentioned by Nicolette. And I'm very happy to welcome here my very good colleague from IDRI, Damian Barshish. Damian has been coordinating this collective work that we have conducted with the European think tanks groups, and he will be presenting the main outcomes of the study. And I hope that this will help us kicking off even more the discussions that we will have in panel one with representatives from PDBs and MDBs.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you so much, Daniele, and thanks to EIE and to the International Training Center of the ILO for the invitation. Next slide, please, Daniele. In order to start this presentation, I wanted to really point out some elements on the SDG alignment from the recent OECD publication, and the recent publication called Achieving SDG Results in Development Cooperation. You will see that many development partners use the SDG to frame their cooperation policies, but still only 55% of development partners have a corporate results framework that fully or partially aims to achieve SDG results. Inertia and on embracing the SDGs is still too high and progress too slow for their use as a holistic guide to consistent and efficient collective action towards sustainable development. Next slide, please, Daniel. So what does it mean to be aligned with the 2030 agenda? Beyond numbers and volume of funding, alignment of finance with the 2030 agenda is the previous speaker already said, it's necessary and urgent. But the true test is not how much is invested in projects that support one of several of the 1 and 69 SDG target. Rather, it is to really ensure that all projects are designed to minimize the negative externalities and maximize the positive externalities across the various SDGs and targets. When it comes to implementing the 2030 Agenda and SDGs, the focus really needs to lie on the principles of integration, transformation, and leaving no one behind. All actors should take steps in this direction, but the public development banks have a certain advantage that enable them to take a position at the forefront of this movement. The lack of SDG elements starts with the lack of common language and interpretation of the objective underlining the SDGs in the public and private sectors. The SDGs were not designed as targets to be met independently, but as a mutual supportive package. The biggest transformative potential of the 2030 Agenda really lies not in pursuing the 17 SDGs individually, but rather in its systemic approach that advance multiple SDGs in an integrated manner. PDBs are natural allies of the 2030 Agenda and SDGs. They have the ability to adapt their role to changing needs at the multilateral, the regional, the national, or the subnational level. However, moving from this radical ambition to an operational approach is not an easy task. It is a continuing process, and where to begin with might depend on the PDB's mandate and the context in which it operates. Next slide, please. So as already mentioned by Nicoletta, and as a contribution to this debate, the European think tank group, ETTG, led by our colleague Maria Alejandra Riaño, has developed a framework with a practical starting points for PDBs to embed the SDGs in their existing and future activities and investments. Concretely, we aim both to propose a definition of SDG alignment and to provide 4 straightforward principles to further operationalize and promote such alignment in practice. How to make alignment operational? Implementing the 2030 Agenda requires PDBs to really ensure coherence and spur a profound change at the scale of their entire organization and across the full range of operation. As such, SDG alignment demands high-level commitment together with deep governance and probably business model restructuring. Any PDB seeking alignment with the 2030 Agenda will have to bring the entire institution on board to embed environmental, social, and economic consideration throughout bank decision-making and day-to-day operation, such maximizing its positive contribution to sustainable development. ETTG's proposal calls for a bank-wide approach, which can lead to a complete and comprehensive and systemic integration of the SDGs. So therefore, we propose 4 principles that will allow PDBs to operationalize their alignment efforts, both internally and externally within their ecosystem. Next slide, please. The first principle is lead internally and foster a sustainable development culture. PDBs need to facilitate and enable a sustainable development culture throughout their respective organization. The bank's DNA has to be fundamentally and prominently linked to sustainable development, from top to bottom, from the highest level directors to those in planning, review, and credit approval position. The 2030 Agenda needs to be a cornerstone for action. To this end, banks could, for instance, start to require qualification in strategic sustainable development areas when hiring new financial experts, as has been done by the newly created Scottish National Investment Bank or by the KfW, for example, and ensure regular monitoring and development of the skills in performance appraisals. As a result, awareness and buy-in of the overarching principles of the 2030 Agenda could be both deepened and accelerating among all employees, leading to more systemic, coherent, and integrated decision. Next slide, please. The second principle is to develop a holistic strategy and a long-term vision. Strong and determined internal leadership should materialize in a vision and strategies that can transform the PDB into a driving force for the 2030 agenda and SDGs. For alignment to be impactful, it is crucial that the bank strategy, mission, vision, and other medium and long-term framework are not just cosmetic communication papers, but are actually linked to the strategic choice made in daily operation. As PDB has differing mandate and geographical scopes, they should promote open exchange with one another to maximize their collective contribution in this regard. Our study presents practical tools such as a strategy building process. This can provide a basis for discussion between stakeholders and help ensure that the new or aligned strategy reflects a balanced approach, particularly across the social and environmental dimension of the SDGs. The presented tools can also help PDBs analyze interaction between different bank priorities within a specific context. Next slide. The third principle is mainstream SDG priorities within internal operation. This entails building a systemic and coherent internal process for analyzing finance with SDG consideration embedded in both the ex-ante and ex-post phases of investments. Such an approach to management will ensure that alignment becomes part and parcel of the whole investment cycle. Some PDBs, such as the French Development Agency or the Asian Development Bank, have developed promising tools to support such a process. Examples are portfolio alignment, applying categorization and differentiation according to context, and adopting a value chain approach to finance sustainable transformation. Merely approving disparate SDG-aligned projects is no guarantee for an aligned and coherent portfolio. And this is crucial. Next slide, please. The last principle is to mobilize and catalyze truly transformative investments supporting sustainable development trajectories. This is where PDB can really be a game changer. Doing so requires fostering proactive external engagement within their ecosystems and of partners, capitalizing on both their financial and also their non-financial services. PDB search need to move beyond projects that respond to opportunistic standalone opportunity and broaden their investment philosophy and approach. In other words, the PDBs need to move from transaction to transformation with local actors, be ready to engage in policy dialogue at the country level to affect transformational change, but also support SDG alignment of their counterpart and beneficiaries. This entails developing new competencies and incentive structure within their organization, like project preparation facilities to ensure SDG bankability. Next slide, please. And in order to conclude, it's important to raise that most PDBs can and should find collaborative way to cover this range of activity by working together, building on the power of partnerships. However, many banks are still focused on the vast investment dimension. For all PDBs, cooperation with other transformative actors will be needed, particularly other relevant PDBs and financial actors, donors, and international and local entities, in order to complement and synergize the different type of interventions. Note that the Financing Comet Summit is becoming an institution and a powerful platform. It is essential to show that it can create a real dynamics between peers and bring out the real SDG champions within the PDB's community that can inspire and draw over banks with concrete examples on how to operationalize the SDG alignment. Thank you so much for your attention.
thanks, Damien, for your keynote, and thanks very much for leading this this work. Not easy to coordinate, but very exciting, and we are happy that you have had the chance today to present the main findings. I invite all interested, students, experts, practitioners to have a look at it, because it's been a very dense and intense work that we collectively conducting under your guidance and lead. I very much like the your idea that the PDBs and MDBs should have within their DNAs a link to the SDGs, and I think this is something that needs to be concretized more in the future. And I think that the best way for us today to assess this is to give the floor and hear from first-hand experience stakeholders and representatives. So I'm now opening panel 1 that actually aims to address the role of PDBs and MDBs in supporting a sustainable transition. Let me present the speakers of this panel. The first one is Jafar Javan, Director of the United Nations System Staff College. It will be followed by Enrico Petrocelli, who is Head of the International Institutional Relations at Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. And then Martha Piri, Director of Human Capital, Youth and Skills Development Department of the African Development Bank Group will intervene. And last but not least, I'm very happy also to have with us Professor Bambang Projonegoro, who has been Minister of Finance and Minister for Development for the government of Indonesia, and now is leading as lead co-chair the T20 Indonesia. So I'll give the floor now for introduction by Jafar Javan, and then I will open the floor for our panelists for their intervention. So Jafar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniele, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here today to participate in this discussion that is so crucial to the success of our efforts for a better future for all of us. While the world has made several strides towards sustainable development since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement in 2015, significant challenges still lie ahead of us, and there is no secret that the COVID pandemic has reversed some of the gains made and severely constrained resources in going forward. Under these conditions, it becomes more important than ever before to divert financial flows from a variety of sectors and multiple different actors to finance sustainable development. Financing sustainable development requires us to reorient the way we think about who's responsible for driving development and how we finance it. It requires us, first and foremost, to view this as a national responsibility, one that needs to be delivered by all stakeholders, and one that will be financed only when non-traditional sources of development finances can also be directed to support sustainable ends. Public and multilateral development banks play a key role in directing finance towards sustainable ends, both by directly investing their resources to support sustainable initiatives, but also by crowding in private finance. Given the risk return profiles in relation to commercial capital, PDPs and MDBs are also best placed to support the long-term investment required for development. PDBs and MDBs have played a critical role in COVID recovery in many countries in terms of support to critical sectors, as well as emergency stimulus packages. However, in order to be truly effective in financing sustainable development, PDPs need to apply a more holistic and nuanced understanding of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, and the initiatives that will help us progress towards those goals. We at the UN System Staff College devoted our efforts to this task of parsing out a more nuanced understanding of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement and the implications for the implementation of the agenda. We emphasize the integrative nature of the agenda through all of our learning products on sustainable development. We highlight that the 17 SDGs and their 169 targets are a result framework, but that the agenda is more than that. It clearly recognizes that the SDGs are integrated and interlinked, that their achievements will entail a system approach and an understanding of synergies, trade-offs, and co-benefits between them. It also emphasizes the transformative nature of the task, that business as usual is unlikely to get us to sustainable development for all. The ETTG study presented earlier today puts its finger on exactly this issue when it identifies the need for a better SDG integration into the strategies of PDBs as one of the most critical aspects. There are two issues here that I would like to talk about. A, alignment to the 2030 Agenda and the SDG has to go beyond mere SDG mapping exercises. Merely mapping existing activities from the perspective of the 17 SDGs. PDBs and MDPs need to make a more strategic view of their investments, sustainable development impact, and the synergies and trade-offs embedded in their portfolio. They would need to take a system perspective of their portfolio and challenge conventional investment allocations. This will mean that PDBs and MDBs need effective ways to identify portfolio synergies and trade-offs and use that information for investment allocation decisions. B, I would like to emphasize the broader perspective of economic transformation. Conventional economic goals are stated and measured in purely economic terms. However, we recognize today that our current economic systems only drive us towards greater social inequality and greater environmental fragility. We need to take a more holistic understanding of economic transformation as one that is both socially just and environmentally sustainable. PDBs need to apply this lens of sustainable economic transformation to all their investments to identify the ones that can be truly catalytic and transformational. As long as we privilege economic growth without considering its social and environmental impacts, sustainable development cannot be achieved. This perspective brings up wider issues on what we value and how we measure value within our own financial system. For BDPs and MDPs, finding ways to incorporate an element of true cost in their investments to include measures of environmental and social costs and benefits would certainly strengthen the impact that their investment could have on sustainability. This is where we can contribute. Our mandate at UNSSC includes building capacities of both UN staff and partners to deliver the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We have a number of learning products, including free open enrollment online courses that examines different aspects of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. A learning path for the UN resident coordinator system covers financing sustainable development and understanding sustainable economic transformation and how the UN registered coordinated system can support national partners in these areas. We create tailor-made learning solutions for a number of different organizations and stakeholders groups, including civil servants, government entities, civil society organizations, and more. And we use our learning platforms to help convene expertise and building coalitions for change. We look forward to being able to support the transformation required to finance sustainable development and stand ready to work with all partners to support any capacity building needs they may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jafar. I think this is a perfect teaser for starting our conversation with our panelists. So Enrico, you did a tremendous job last year with the Financing Commons Summit. We all acknowledge that, and we appreciated that the efforts that you're also making, let's say at European and both at European and global level to, even stress the role that PDBs can have in the sustainable transition. So my question to you is, can you tell us, what are your activities that you are conducting in this sector, and what are your plans? The floor is yours. Thanks again.
Thanks, Daniele. Hello, everybody. Let me thank you first of all, Istituto Affari Internazionali, the International Training Center, for promoting such an interesting, useful event on the role of PDBs in financing SDGs. And let me thank you also the European think tank group for the study just presented and the work done, as Daniele already mentioned, in the run-up to the last year Financing Commons Summit edition. I'm very glad to be here to bring in some thoughts from my perspective of Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, the Italian National Promotional Institution, the Italian Development Finance Institution, in the overall effort of PDBs in bringing forward the SDGs agenda. As Daniele mentioned, I will refer mainly to the work we did and we are still doing in the Financing Commons movement. Last year, we coordinated and led the organization of the summit we hosted in Rome. Financing Commons is really a global movement of public development banks. It gathers more than 450 multilateral, regional and national development banks. The main goal is really to foster, to orient the financial flow and the long-term strategic investments of public financial institutions towards the implementation of the SDGs and the Paris agenda on climate. So this coordinated effort is really shaping a quite powerful global movement of financial institutions, trying to really make a concrete effort and make an impact on the medium and long-term direction of the economic development at global stage. With the combined assets of more than $20 trillion, public development banks in this regard can really play a significant role. As already said, the overall amount of investments that are mobilized by PDBs is about over $2 trillion, around 10% of the total global investment. So it's quite a huge amount of money. We really need to reorient on key priorities in support to the green and digital transition into key SDGs, sustainable development goals. In this regard, I just want to refer to some of the concrete discussion and deliverables and also outcome, concrete operational outcome we had at the occasion of the last Financing Common Summit that we hosted the last October in Rome. This was really, I think, an extremely important opportunity to touch base with the international financial community. We promoted the summit under the patronage and with the support of the Italian G20 presidency. This has been done by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti in partnership with IDFC and with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and with the support of the whole Financing Common Coalition. And we managed together the whole development bank community, but also key stakeholders from national government, central banks, private sector, civil society. We had 14 regional and multilateral banks participating, 14 thematic coalitions involved, 11 reports, including the one that we just mentioned, several 8 thematic statements with some operational commitments that we took in Rome. And I want to thank once again IAI to bring in also the T20 in this process in the context of the Financing Common. But I just want to mention maybe 2-3 concrete deliverables and commitments that we took that can in a way showcase how the PDBs can play really can operationalize the discussion around the implementation of the SDGs. First of all, thematic strong focus of the summit has been the financing of sustainable agricultural food systems. In this regard, we managed together quite a huge, broad coalition of PDBs, and we took the decision in Rome to establish a new PDB platform for green and inclusive food systems with more than 40 PDBs specialized in agriculture, and more than 70 PDBs with large portfolios in the agricultural sector. The aim of this new platform that is about to be launched in very operational term, we aim at contributing to closing the estimated financial gap towards sustainable agriculture, which is about $350 billion per year. So it's really a huge effort we want to make on supporting the transition towards more sustainable agriculture and agribusiness systems. You know, this is very much linked not only to the support of economic development of developing countries. The agricultural sector is key in this regard, but also is very much linked to the effort to address some climate issues at global stage. So this is one of the key outcome of the summit, the launching of this PDB platform for financing sustainable agricultural systems. The second concrete deliverable has been the agreement among the 4 main European national development banks, CDP, the Italian CDP, French AFD, the German KfW, and the Spanish ICID, with the establishment of the European Strategic Cooperation Framework, which basically is an enhanced partnership among those 4 PDBs, European PDBs, which decided to take joint initiative and structuring a co-financing platform in the context, in the framework of the European Commission Team Europe initiatives, and obviously in the run-up to the upcoming multi-annual financial framework. So to support, coordinate, to support and to put in motion coordinated action on international development and cooperation projects as key European PDBs in close cooperation with the European Commission. And the main focus that has been decided to take for the first joint initiatives of this announced partnership has been Africa, the support to the African economic development. And this will be, I think, very high on the agenda in coming weeks in the run-up to the European Union, African Union Summit, which is about to take place mid-February. So this is a second key, I think, outcome from the summit, which showcases how also more, let's say, close cooperation among PDBs can really take shape and facilitate and foster also medium long-term investments in key regions and in key sectors. So in this case, the strong focus will be on Africa, but obviously there will be also other thematic focus. Third point, it has been and still will be the focus of PDBs on climate change and biodiversity. In this regard, we acknowledge in Rome that the overall effort of MDBs in the climate finance sector has been in the last year around roughly around $70 billion mobilized by the entire MDBs community. In this regard, a new commitment has been taken to further increase this financial effort and to launch a specific national and multilateral initiative to promote climate finance and green finance, and to connect also to some initiatives that have been launched at the occasion of the COP26. I skipped this part in order to be a bit to shorten a bit my contribution. The last point I want to make, it's a more general one, a broad one. I mentioned specific initiative on sustainable agriculture, on Africa, on climate adaptation, on green economy. But I think that one of the key points that is really at the core of the discussion we had, and we are going to have in coming months in the Finance in Common movement, is very much about how we can further strengthen the international financial architecture, how we can promote a global public finance infrastructure to boost public investments and to make sure that the blending with the private resources can make sure to mobilize enough public and private capitals in the support of some medium and long-term goals. We see that currently in the recovery phase in Europe, but also in other continents, we are facing a quite huge amount of public liquidity. But the point, in our view, is really to make sure to have enough long-term investments to support in the long-term some strategic investments for the digital and green transition. And in this regard, we think that a powerful instrument is can be represented by the special drawing rights, the international supplementary reserve asset created by the IMF. And in this regard, the proposed allocation of $650 billion of special drawing rights to support investments in and to dealing with the debt issue, to support investment on the post-pandemic economic recovery, especially for the less developed country, we think is a key issue on which, and this has been also recognized by the G20 finance ministers last October as a key tool to support a sustainable transition for all, and especially for the less developed countries. In this regard, the role played by MDBs and PDBs is really a key. We consider that the MDBs mandate, their unique leveraging capabilities can really be instrumental in channeling SDRs resources to support the SDGs agenda. I'm really stop here. I just wanted to mention some few concrete examples. I want just to recall that one other outcome of the Finance in Common has been the official recognition by the G20 of the framework of Finance in Common as the official counterpart to organize the discussion with PDBs. There is a specific task that we received from the G20 finance ministers to report on progress of Finance in Common for the coming months under the Indonesian presidency. So we work on this progress report. Obviously, this will include some very concrete policy recommendations to the G20 governments for the coming months. And we do hope that obviously this discussion will have another key moment of global discussion, education of the third Financing Commons Summit, which will be hosted this year by the African Development Bank and by the European Investment Bank. As Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, we will continue to support this process. We will be part of the core group. We will continue to make sure that the implementation of our goal will be put in motion, and the connection with the overall discussion on the implementation of the SDGs will be further developed. And I'll stop here, and happy to I want to thank you once again for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to hear from the other speakers. Thanks, Daniele.
Thank you so much, Enrico, and I think you did a perfect assist now, because I'm very happy to introduce you all the next speaker, Martha Piri from the African Development Bank Group. As Enrico said, the African Development Bank Group will host the third edition of the Financing Commons Summit, and you have, Martha, a very privileged position, because you are facing on the ground several challenges to sustainable development transition. So I really would like to hear from you. What is your perspective as an African speaker in this panel about these issues? The floor is yours, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you everybody for inviting African Development Bank to this conversation. So I'm delighted to speak on behalf of the bank during this very important and timely discussion on financing sustainable development goals. Let me thank, of course, ITC and ILO and partners for organizing this event. At the bank, the heart of our work is centered around youth. So I'm very glad to see so many of our young people participating today. I hope we can all learn from our fruitful discussions. And I want to set the context, Daniel, like you have said. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has brought into sharp focus and likely amplified the huge socioeconomic inequalities existing between Africa and the rest of the world, particularly in terms of access to quality healthcare, scientific and technological capabilities, and many others. I'll just give two striking statistics. At the onset of the pandemic, only 2 labs on the entire continent had the capacity to diagnose COVID-19. At the same time, Africa was importing between 70 to 90% of pharmaceuticals and manufacturing, just 1% of global vaccines. Against this background, more than half of African countries could not meet the WHO target of vaccinating 10% of their population as at end December 2021. As we speak, only 11% are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, that is. On the other front, the impact was enormous. Millions of learners could not continue accessing education during lockdowns, of course, due to lack of access to online learning technologies. Economic growth has slowed down. Africa, in fact, faced its first recession in decades. Jobs, particularly for young people, have been lost and continue to be lost, pushing nearly 40 million people into poverty in 2021. Positive growth projections for most African countries are facing serious downside risks as COVID-19 variants emerge in different parts of the world, while the African population is not adequately vaccinated to reach herd immunity. With this background, Chairperson, you can see that the battle to make strong progress towards SDGs will be won if Africa benefits from the scaling up of financing. That is why this conversation is so important, and we want to thank you for organizing it. Now, you know that the SDG financing gap of $2.5 trillion may have worsened and remains big. So hence we need to mobilize and catalyze truly transformative investments. And this has become urgent. Traditional approaches to resource mobilization need to be rethought, re-engineered, and reinvigorated. Financing SDG means more than ever, we need to work as one unified systems, developing innovative mechanisms to ensure financial inclusion. During the pandemic in 2020, the bank launched a $10 billion crisis response facility to provide financing to countries to address rising fiscal challenges at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, to save lives, but also to save jobs. The bank also launched a $3 billion fight COVID-19 social bond on the global capital market, the largest ever US dollar denominated social bond in world history. This is the way we should be going. However, much more is needed. We are hopeful and encouraged by the issuance of SDRs by the IMF, which offers a new ray of hope, if well used, to support most low-income countries, including Africa, to address many, many challenges. As Africa's premier financial institution with a AAA rating and a prescribed holder of SDRs, the African Development Bank has a strong backing of all public development banks on the continent, as well as member countries, to support them using SDRs to help drive economic recovery. At the core of our work, if you allow me to share, there's a very clear strategy to fast-track Africa's sustainable development and resilience. The bank's 10-year strategy on inclusive growth and transition to green growth is premised on 5 priority areas. And then is anchored around 5 high fives, which we call high fives at the bank. The first is light up and power Africa, feed Africa, integrate Africa, industrialize Africa, and improve the quality of life of Africans. According to the UNDP's 2017 report on strengthening strategic alignment for Africa's development, if Africa achieves these high fives, it would have achieved 90% of the African Union's Agenda 2063 and 90% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see that we are on the right track and certainly addressing some of the inequalities that we are seeing. Of course, this will require financing. What we have seen is that official development assistance as a share of government expenditure to low-income countries, particularly in Africa, has sharply declined, reaching about 8% in 2019, from a high of 23% in 2005. As a result, governments have become increasingly reliant on debt financing to fund development programs. Unfortunately, debt overhang or poor credit ratings limit the ability of African countries to raise affordable capital to fund their development. So it is our view at the bank that the starting point for us in this conversation is to look at domestic financing environment and explore opportunities for improving efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability of financing. Here are a couple of considerations. We must support countries, particularly low-income countries in Africa, enhance their capacity for sustainable public debt management so as to get them back on a sustainable path. We must support these countries, enhance domestic resource mobilization, deepen capital market, make financial services more inclusive to mobilize savings and curb illicit financial flows. The audience and you, Chairperson, may wish to note that on an annual basis, it shows about 6.7 billion in US dollars is lost due to tax avoidance on the continent, and 88.6 billion is lost due to the capital flight from Africa. The bank, through its strategy for economic governance in Africa, is supporting regional member countries in their efforts to enhance public revenue collection by ensuring that their tax systems are broadened, modernized, and ready to implement Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Through relevant tax policy reforms, but as well as building institutional capacity to boost non-trade tax revenues. It is also supporting efficiency and quality of spending, including strengthening capacity for public debt management. The bank is working with African capital markets to address weaknesses in their structure, policy, and regulatory environment, enlarging the pool of investors with an emphasis on domestic pension funds. We also need to support the member countries' efforts to curb corruption. The bank estimates that about $148 billion per year, which is about 4% of the continent's GDP, is lost to corruption in Africa. The framework for enhanced engagement with civil society that we have promotes citizens' access to information about commitments that the states have made and whether they have met them. Now, in an environment where African countries are facing increasing pressure on their fiscal balance sheets, the bank is supporting member countries in scaling up development financing through the mobilization of private capital to finance or co-finance public sector investments and social service delivery. We're looking at blended financing as an opportunity to leverage concessional financing from ourselves, of course, and other development partners, as well as philanthropy organizations that are emerging as partners in public investments through public-private partnership. There is a high potential in this space, Chairperson. Between 2006 and 2017, 29 African countries mobilized around $3.2 billion in PPP transactions. We must exploit this. The bank's public-private partnership framework for 2021 to 2031 seeks to support Africa countries in 3 key ways: strengthening the PPP enabling environment, supporting project preparation and transaction advisory service, and then financing PPP project development through its entire pool of available instruments, including dates, equity, risk mitigation instruments, and guarantees, as well as credit enhancement through non-sovereign operation. This financing will be provided through a PPP project company. In addition, the bank will finance government contributions to PPP projects in the form of viability gap grants, capital grants, and concessional loans. This is a continuation, it's something that we've been doing. We must take an ecosystem approach, and I'm glad previous speakers have spoken to this. Not only just looking at providing and scaling up financing, but also looking at supporting African countries, of course, low-income countries, in undertaking evidence-based policy reforms, providing them with technical assistance to build capacity, and of course, strengthen the partnerships, including the one we're having today, in order to make big progress. Finally, in the end, Chairperson, what we see is that financing will be effective in driving progress towards SDGs if it targets levers of transformation, namely agriculture and agribusiness, which is the biggest employer on the continent, power, so that we can connect our schools, our homes, our industries, industrialization, so we can increase manufacturing capabilities, integration for a more attractive and bigger market on the continent, as well as public health and sciences. These are the things that we are learning, that they are important in terms of moving forward. And then, of course, technology and innovation. So we have to do this in a manner that is inclusive, green and climate resilience, leverages technology and innovation while promoting the creation of quality jobs for youth, whether through employment, of course, and self-employment. I think this is where we would like this conversation to go. But I've taken a little bit longer, Chairperson, you excuse me, but I thank you and everybody else for their attention.
Thank you so much, Martha. I think it's always great to get in this kind of debates the African perspective, which is in some cases not too much brought into the agenda. So I'm very grateful for your intervention. Now, last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Professor Bambang Brojonegoro. He has been Ministry of Development and Ministry of Finance for the government of Indonesia, and is now leading the G20, one of the engagement groups of the G20. I'm glad you can also bring to the table the perspective of the G20. We know that G20 members have been very actively involved in mobilizing sustainable finance for development in these years, and I'm would be very happy to hear from you. What are the plans that you as a T20 chairs are planning to do, and what is also the Asian perspective, all these problems in this debate? So Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Distinguished speakers, participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Instituto Afari Internazionale, IAI, and the organizing committee for the invitation and opportunity to share with all of you what I have learned about SDGs financing. With less than a decade for action, because it's 2030 SDGs, the SDGs financing gap in developing countries is expected to have grown by at least 50% by early 2021, reaching around $3.7 trillion. The pandemic has exacerbated the scissors effect of the SDG financial gap, demonstrated by increasing financing needs on one side and decreasing sources of fund on the other side. While governments will continue to play an important role in funding, notably in delivering basic public services, the public sector funding alone will not meet the SDGs' financial needs. The unprecedented crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic has once again called for the global development community to act together in response to common challenges. In particular, it is crucial for public development banks, PDBs, and of course, the MDBs, multilateral development banks, to further strengthen collaboration and partnership, not only among themselves, but also with other development partners, both public and private spheres. The PDBs and MDBs play a vital role in supporting countries' effort to advance the SDGs through direct financing and assistance for projects and programs in the public and private sectors, and by helping mobilize and catalyze public and private resources toward SDG-aligned investments. It's also because the PDBs and MDBs have more opportunities to have more knowledge, skills, resources, and assets to reduce the financial gap in many areas of the SDGs. The PDBs and MDBs should continue to seek to respond to the national priorities of their countries of operation and to complement each other's intervention. While each development bank has its own reporting frameworks, 2020 report on financing the Sustainable Development Goals indicated that 11 MDBs have sought to demonstrate how their operation contribute to countries' progress on the SDGs. The urgency and scope of capital mobilization for the 2030 agenda are now mission critical. Realizing this, the T20 Indonesia, Think 20 Indonesia, where I serve as a lead co-chair, has a dedicated task force discussing the global cooperation for SDGs financing. Given the diversity of the context and stages of development, the G20 efforts should aim for a globally oriented but domestically adaptable solution. By developing the proposed common framework that fosters public and private contribution towards sustainable development, cascading policy reforms would be country-specific, allowing each jurisdiction to effectively scale and streamline its sustainable finance strategy, yet allowing for functional equivalence to provide clarity and equal footing. To end my intervention on behalf of the T20 Indonesia, I would like to invite everyone in this webinar to join and participate in the T20 Inception Conference on February 9 to 10, 2022. This event is an opening meeting for the group of think tanks and research institute that aims to guide policy innovation during Indonesia's G20 presidency that address priority areas ranging from climate change to digital transition, from social cohesion to growth and financial stability. And of course, for more information on the event, you could visit our website on www.t20indonesia.org. Thank you very much. And of course, back to you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Professor Brojonegoro, and also thank you for reminding about this important meeting next week. Before we close this panel, I think I will try to merge some of the questions raised by the participants in the Q&A. Some of them mentioned the issue of the challenges that make harder to provide transparent and resilient financing and sustainable development, whereas others focused on how on the lessons learned that can be brought forward. So maybe we can start from the other round, and maybe I would like to ask all the panelists to, from your perspective, what are the main lessons learned that you can draw and that you will strengthen and focus more in 2022 to avoid that the already existing challenges that were exacerbated by COVID make sustainable financing even more difficult. So, Professor Bambang, what is your perspective from Indonesia, like lessons learned that you can bring to the table to, foster the debate and also decision-making process towards this goal?
Yeah, I believe the key would be about the recovery process itself. We know that COVID-19 is not over yet. And in most of the countries globally, they are still trying to fight on the COVID itself. But at the same time, I believe this year, 2022, should be the first year of the recovery. And of course, the emphasis would be economic recovery. And to deal with this economic recovery, then to combine with the SDGs financing, my opinion is that every government needs to synchronize between their recovery stages after pandemic and the way to recover from the SDGs goal itself. We know that during the pandemic, we might miss some goals related to the 17 goals of SDGs. But if we try to combine that, we synchronize that with the economic recovery process, I believe then the government can do one thing to solve two problems. I mean, the first problem would be recovery after the pandemic, and the second problem about the shortage of the SDGs financing. And with the limitation on the debt financing market today, because every country already raised their debt at maybe at the maximum level, then of course we cannot push too much on the financial market, and instead we need to really synchronize our development program. So the recovery, economic recovery, and the SDGs goal achievement will be in the same sort of the strategy for every government. I believe that would be one of the possible solutions, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I think you, as a bank of ideas of the G20 policy process, will do a tremendous job, and there will be, important appointments and events this year that you will be leading that will help the research community to bring, evidence-based policy recommendations to this process. So thanks again for your intervention. Martha, what is your perspective on this? I mean, what are lessons learned from the African side that you can bring to the table? Enrico mentioned before the issue of SDRs reallocation. We know that only a limited part of it so far will go to least developed countries. So what are the challenges that you see and the lessons that you can bring in this process from your African point of view?
Thank you, Daniel. I think I would like to reiterate the points that I raised that speaks to the lessons coming out of the COVID-19. And one of the biggest lessons is that we need governments to come back to the drawing table and prioritize increased budget allocation to drivers of socioeconomic transformation. And in the case of Africa, it's very, very clear that we need to have increased budget allocations to public health. We need to have increased budget allocation to education, particularly to improve scientific capabilities and innovation. That is key. But beyond that, we need to make sure that we are investing in sectors that create jobs, in which most of our youth are employed. So we have agriculture sector, which employs about 60%, modernize it. Make sure that you take agriculture as a business. This is the case in most of our other, other countries on the continent, other regions rather on the continent, where farming is a business. Make sure that it's modernized, so that the youth are able to have access to quality jobs. But at the same time, industrialize Africa to make sure that, we increase manufacturing on the continent, and then make sure that the markets attractive. So governments need to make sure that they show ownership of the transformation agenda by allocating more. And of course, it has to be prudent. It has to be prudent so that we are not on a trajectory that is not sustainable in terms of debt. There are many holes that we can plug in terms of where Africa is losing its resources through corruption or illicit financial flows. Let's close them. And then the second lesson that we have learned is on the power of partnerships. And it starts with here, right now, the partnerships that we're having here, but also going beyond this partnership by really making sure that private sector plays a big role. That in other continents, we've seen private sector playing the big role. We have actually seen that actually private sector can come to the table and address some of the social services that we thought is just for social sector. MasterCard Foundation, for instance, I mean, they just announced 1.5 billion. Of course, it's a philanthropy arm of the MasterCard Foundation, but that's essentially part of the liquidity we should be targeting beyond the direct investment by private sector. $1.5 billion to support vaccination on the continent. That's where we should be going to make sure that we leverage partnerships with the private sector through PPPs and direct NSOs. Lastly, just to highlight one key point, to say it took just one big pandemic to erode all the gains we had made in creating jobs for our youth. I think this should be the focus going forward, and it has to be piggybacked on climate resilience efforts to make sure that we don't find ourselves here where Malawi, Zimbabwe, Zambia, now they are struggling with Storm Anna, people are dying, but at the same time, they're fighting the pandemic. We can't. It will erode all the gains that we have made and will not go close to SDGs. So yes, let's focus on these areas, but make sure that our goal and our target should remain creating jobs for youth, for inclusion, jobs that are green and resilient as well. And again, lastly, Chair, if you allow me, it should not just be training our youth to be employed. It's not enough. We need to train our youth to start their own businesses. And we need to create an enabling environment where that should be possible for our youth, and not just through grants and small pieces of investment. It has to be at scale and taking a private sector approach. So jobs for youth in Africa is crucial in terms of supporting financing for sustainable development. Sorry, Chairperson, I had to go all the way. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Martha, for raising the social dimension of sustainability. We will address that with in the second panel with Vincenzo, but I think that this topic is crucial, and COVID risks exacerbating this generational divide. So I think it's what you said is really essential. Enrico, like Martha also mentioned the role of agribusiness in this sustainable transformation, and you have put agribusiness sustainable transition as one core priority of the Financing Commons Summit. What are your plans and lessons learned that you can share with the audience on this?
Yeah, thanks, Daniele. I think that we really need to focus on, maybe I will keep a broader focus, not just only on sustainable agriculture, financing sustainable agriculture, but really more broadly on financing sustainable development. I think we really need to focus on, at least this is our perspective, which we are very much working also for coming months, on I would say 2, 3, 4 key priorities. First of all, to continue to address the issue of financial risk mitigation and address some legal and regulatory barriers which prevents more medium long-term investments. This is the case for infrastructure, but for key sector energy and digital and other key sectors, on which I think we need really to work a bit more, as I said, to combine the quite huge amount of public money, liquidity that is definitely not an issue in this moment, but we really need to have a more medium long-term perspective and see how we can facilitate risk mitigation to better mobilize private capitals to complement the public investments and the public initiatives that we are putting forward in the recovery phase. So I think this is a key point: risk mitigation, address legal and regulatory barriers to foster public and private investments in the long term. Second point, I think, is the work on ESG criteria for investment, on which I think we are still lacking kind of common ground and some common global standards. There is an ongoing discussion in the G20 framework. We are very far from some concrete joint outcomes. So I think really this is something on which we really need to look into very, very closely, how we can work on ESG criteria for lending policy that can be better aligned to SDGs and to climate adaptation goals. Third point, I think we really need to work hard on long-term and transnational infrastructural investment plans. And I think this is very much about not only green and digital, but it's also very much about social infrastructure, what has been just mentioned. So I think this is something on which the regional and multilateral cooperation will be key. So I was just mentioning the EU African Union summit. I think hopefully some news in this regard should come and discuss also in that framework, and will continue to contribute in this regard. Last point, I think we need much more quality and bankable projects, because I think there is a quite huge amount of liquidity, but there is a lack of good projects actually of quality and definitely bankable projects that can be financed and founded in the short term on the green and digital transition. In this regard, I think the PDBs has a role to play. We say usually that we have to move from being just simple project takers to project makers, and I think this is also something that implies an additional role from PDB's perspective, not just being financial institutions, but really to have a more holistic approach in terms of financing, but also of developing a specific expertise in putting forward quality and bankable projects. These are just a few priorities on which we continue to focus, and I want to once again thank you for this opportunity. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to hear from the next session. Thanks.
Thanks, Enrico. Thanks very much for this emphasis on the need to shift from being simple project takers to project makers, and this is a paradox that within this large liquidity, there is a lack of bankable projects. To close this panel, I would like now, last but not least, to give the floor to Javan. Jafar, Martha mentioned in her speech also the role of science for innovation, and Enrico now mentioned the importance of metrics. We will address metrics and the lack of common frameworks also with Federico Bonaglia from the ICT Development Center. But what is your overall perspective on these topics, but also on the topics that we have discussed in this panel?
Thank you, Daniele. If I have to look at the role of education and learning, and I think other panels have alluded to the critical role of the education, is that we still haven't done enough in terms of really presenting the 2030 agenda as a holistic agenda. I think we talk about it, we write about it, but when it comes into implementation, we don't act as if it's really an integrated agenda, which the goals are interdependent. We cannot be pushing for one particular goal without its impact on the other goals. And I have to say that this is something which we, even in the United Nations, we're guilty of doing that. You know, we started to talk about it at the beginning when the 2030 agenda initiatives were launched in the sort of a post-2015 period. But somehow I still don't exactly see when it comes to implementation that we are really looking at the system as a whole with the system thinking and pushing towards a holistic approach to the implementation of the agenda. That's one. So if we are going to, I think, focus on education, on training, on learning, then I think this message that somehow looking at sector by sector or sectors in isolation is not going to be that effective as compared to a sort of a learning agenda that looks at the whole integration process. I think that is going to create problems. Now, one issue that Marta brought up, and I'd like to just follow up, is on the role of partnership. I think at the partnership, well, I fully agree with everything that she said. I think we have to also pay attention to the crucial, critical role of community and local organizations. I think if one thing we have learned from the pandemic is that if you don't get organizations, community-based organizations and local-based organizations involved in policy discussion, you're not going to exactly sort of reach the people at the local level. While national governments are critical in terms of national policies, while partnership with the private sector is crucial, while connection with the local authorities are important, let's not forget the community-based organizations. That's where the action takes place. And that's, in my view, it's where basically you have your biggest asset, which is the people themselves. So get them involved in policy making and get them involved in the implementation.
Thank you so much, Jafar, and thank you for all the speakers' interventions. I think we learned a lot from this first panel and also from previous interventions in the welcoming remarks and in the keynote speech by Damian Varshish. I've been really grateful to chair this panel where we basically virtually traveled across the different regions of the world, experiencing and learning from perspectives from different countries that are deeply involved in this processes. So really, it's been an honor to guide you in this discussion. Now, I would just give a super short 5 minutes virtual coffee break for all of us, and then we will keep our discussion with panel 2. Panel 2 will be moderated by my colleague Vincenzo Fucci from the ICT ILO, and it will be focused on the innovative financial mechanisms that can be identified to support the sustainable finance transition. So from my side, thanks again for all the speakers for their interventions and for accepting our invitation, and I look forward for the start panel 2 under the guidance of Vincenzo.
Welcome back, everyone. I think that we can now reconvene and start the second panel. Just let me wait for the speakers to be sure that they all are here with us. Okay. So once again, so I introduce myself. I'm Vincenzo Fucci from the ITC ILO, and now I assume the role of a moderator in this second panel. Thanks obviously to the AI, and thanks to Daniele for the opportunity to moderate this very interesting panel. Just a few words before starting, let me say that unfortunately, Professor Daniela Gabor from University of West England will not be able to join us today for personal reason, but we have Mr. Federico Bonaglia from the OECD and Professor Jesse Aye from the University of Manitoba. So with regard to this second panel, I confirm the same rules and settings adopted in the first one by my colleague Daniele. So as done before, I invite all the attendees to write down questions and remarks in the Q&A box. So the agenda will be the same of the first model. So first I will introduce the topic and the speakers, then I will give them the floor. And after that, we'll have the opportunity to interact with a Q&A session with these panelists. This panel that goes under the name of Finding Innovative Mechanism to Support Finance for Sustainable Development, as obviously you can see from the title, will focus on the difficulties that some countries face in the attempt to access development finance, and obviously also on the identification of new avant-garde mechanism, tools, but also strategies to spot and also to catalyze financial resources into the achievement of the SDGs. So before giving the floor to the speakers of this second panel, just let me introduce them very briefly. We have Federico Bonaglia, who is the Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center. He supports the director in the implementation of the program of the center and also ensure the high proficient standard of the analysis and advices released by the OECD, which, as you all know, is one of the most important actors in providing policy orientation. And is also strengthened the engagement of the center with different realities from Latin America to Africa. And then there is Professor Jesse Ayer from the University of Manitoba, based in Winnipeg. Is also research associate with the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives. His field of specialization are political economy, public policy, but also one of the most hotly debated topic of these times, that is social and solidarity economy. So I will start this panel with the first panelist, Mr. Federico Bonaglia. First of all, thank you for being here today. And just let me ask you, in light of what has been said before, introduced by Ms. Marta Firi, and also as Deputy Director of the OECD Development Center, how the OECD, that is again one of the most important and the most proficient international actors, not only in providing policy orientation, but also in sharing good practice at international level, how the OECD is positioned in relation to the difficulties, this theme that are the difficulties of some countries in accessing development finance. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo. And let me start by thanking IAI and the ILO Center in Turin for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and congratulations to the speakers from the first panel for a very interesting set of insights and ideas. Well, the question you're asking me is the famous paradox that many economists have been looking at. Capital should be flowing to where opportunities are. And if you look at needs and demographics, it's clear that developing countries are the countries where the highest opportunities for returns are. There is a huge need to close infrastructure gaps. There are young population. Just think about Africa, where the median age today is 19 years, and where in 2050, 1 out of 4 born citizens will be African. And you compare that to aging in Europe, Asia, and other parts of the world. So clearly, one should say we should see capital flowing towards developing countries at massive rates. But unfortunately, this is not the case. And why this is not the case? Well, risk-adjusted returns is probably the answer that many will put forward, meaning that risks are too high. And so when you properly measure those risks in developing countries, the return is not the one that you would expect given the opportunities. This is the reason why, as many in the previous segment said, international financial institutions are increasingly focusing on the provision of risk mitigation tools, because they see this as an opportunity for incentivizing the private sector to go into areas that they're not currently considering. And this, of course, poses plenty of important questions in terms of who should be bearing the risk and for what return. And this is the reason why within the OECD, but also in many other international organizations, there is over the last few years, a growing debate on the role of what is called blended finance, that was also discussed in the previous panel, And there is very clear understanding that blended finance should be addressed and mobilizing capital that would have not otherwise be mobilized. And this is a very important aspect to be taken into account. So blended finance is a strategic use of public finance, of public money, taxpayer money, to mobilize private finance, not for whatever goals, but to finance the SDGs, and to mobilize capital that would have not otherwise be mobilized. So this is an important distinction to an important concept to clarify upfront. Now, if we look at the current situation in the LDCs in terms of financial challenges and what are some of the reasons that may explain why they're not managing to attract more, well, it is clear that the financing gaps have been widening. The COVID crisis has been part of the picture. Because on one hand, you have increasing spending needs, and on the other hand, you have declining revenues, both domestic taxation and international flows. But if you look at the sources of financing for the LDCs, you will see that there are certain peculiarities. If you just look at the mix, for example, the financing mix, the biggest source of financing is, of course, domestic revenues, taxation. But while in the LDCs, tax represents more or less 14% of GDP, in other low income countries, tax to GDP is around 19-20%. So LDCs still have a gap in terms of mobilization of domestic resources. If you then look at external resources, quite surprisingly, one could think that aid, official development assistance, is the most important source of external financing. This has been the case in the past, but today the most important component are remittances. So more than 50% of the external financing mix of LDCs is represented by people's remittances, migrants' remittances. These are private money, of course, so they cannot be strictly equated to private investment or official development assistance. Official development assistance comes second, and it's about 48% if we mix up both official development assistance properly defined and other official flows that may be non-concessional flows. And then, quite staggering, the amount of private investment going into the LDCs as a share of the overall external financial mix is 1%. And this is in stark contrast to 14-15% in other developing countries. So if you look at this picture, you say, on one end, we are having huge financial needs. On the other hand, the financing mix shows that domestic resources are not as high as they are in other developing countries. And the external resources only see a very small share of capital from private lenders, private investors going into LDCs. This explains why a lot of the political and policy attention has been devoted to understanding how to mobilize additional private capital into the LDCs. And here I would maybe conclude, and I would be happy to, of course, to follow up in a second round of questions. The results that the OECD has collected in terms of the capacity of public finance to mobilize private finance in the LDCs show that, unfortunately, these efforts have been not very successful. The OECD produces every 2-3 years a report that looks at the amount of blended finance or private finance mobilized by public sector, either bilateral agencies or the multilateral development banks. And the LDCs account for only 6% of the total of the blended finance mobilized by these institutions. And if you look a bit more into the details, and if you even take a longer time span, like the last 8-10 years, the amount of private finance mobilized is only 13.5 billions. Within this 13.5 billions, which is the total amount of blended finance mobilized for the LDCs over the last 8 years, 5 countries receive more than 1 billion. You have 12 LDCs that receive less than 10 millions. Sorry, so you have 5 countries that are receiving more than 1 billion, 10 that are receiving less than 10 millions, and the average share for the average amount for the other 30 LDCs is in the round of 270 millions. So little mobilized, highly concentrated in a few countries, and for many countries, it's really peanuts, basically. So why is this the case? Well, there are many reasons. One is clearly that capital markets in LDCs are not as well developed as in other parts of the world. And in order to engineer financial projects, you need an ecosystem with many actors and policies and capacities that may be lacking. Well, another reason is also that if you look at the economic structure of the LDCs, there is a highly dependence on commodities. And this explains also the structure of the blended finance. Most of the blended finance mobilized goes into the energy sector, for example. And then if you look, I mean, a third reason for this lack of mobilization is probably because governments have not been able to provide credible investment strategies and investment opportunities. If you are an investor, you want to have a clear plan of projects that you can credibly invest in. And if you think that, for example, in Africa, in African countries, 80% of the infrastructure projects do not pass the feasibility study stage. This shows you that there is a problem in developing projects that can be considered bankable or investable. So I gave you a broad overview. I'm sorry it was a bit long, and I hope that I was able to address your question, Vincenzo.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Obviously, your analysis also of the flow of capital made me think of the Lucas paradox that all the economists well known, and also the fact that it is a paradox, as you say. And also great overview on the financial resources availability and these difficulties that some countries have been facing. And I would like also to focus on the aspect of blended finance, to follow up with the second panelist, Professor Jesse Heyer. I had already the opportunity to read some of your latest publication, Jesse, but also the pleasure to attend some of your lectures here at the Master in Social Innovation for Sustainable Development. So I would like to ask you, as we are focusing on innovative mechanisms to support finance for sustainable development, and also because Ms. Philippos has raised this topic of the social dimension of finance. What is the role of social impact finance? What is the role that it can play in the achievement of the SDGs?
Thank you, Vincenzo. I appreciate you having me here today to speak. I'm looking forward to speaking on from the perspective of social impact financing models, such as development impact bonds. But before I jump into that, I'd like to briefly speak to the report the event is centered around today and the topic of public banks. Public banks do not get the recognition they deserve. We have the report focusing on public development banks, and the authors have well highlighted their inherent strategic advantage and how they're positioned well to contribute to social financing more broadly. The report clearly highlights the benefits of the public development banks when it comes to contributing finance to meeting social objectives, such as those articulated in the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And just to quote that report, they speak of how PDBs can often access funding that is both cheaper and longer term than what the private investors can obtain, and that this enables the PDBs to provide affordable patient capital. Further, the development mandates prioritize development impacts over profit. I think this is a very important point when we speak to what can private finance contribute versus these more public models. I'd also like to highlight how the public development banks are also only a subset of the total public banking sector. If you include public commercial banks, public saving banks, in addition to public development banks and the broader public bank universe, we have a significant number of institutions and size of assets held. So Thomas Marois, in his Cambridge University Press book on public banking, notes that in 2020, using a majority ownership criteria, there were 910 public banks with 49 trillion in assets. So the capacity of this public banking sector is quite large. They've also played a historic role, not just the public development banks, but partnerships between broader developmental strategies and the commercial public banks in both developing countries from China to Costa Rica, but as well in the global north, in European countries like Germany and France. So these public-private financial relationships are fundamental and have a strong historical root. Now, the report highlights how, despite this track record, despite these advantages of the public side, change is afoot. We have the public development banks increasingly being expected to mobilize private investment to realize goals such as the SDGs and the goals in the Paris Agreement. So the mobilization structures for PDBs to do this, to support this activity, to leverage private investment, include things like cooperation and syndication, securitization, issuing financial products, and as you noted, blended finance. So I'm going to speak to a related concept, the social impact investment model, and how these mechanisms are envisioned in these broader discussions. Impact bonds in particular is the area I've studied most extensively, so I'll use that as the key example. But the arguments here, I believe, are transferable to other models that are similar and have a similar logic. Blended finance, PPPs, impact bonds, all driven by this notion of the benefit of partnering with the private sector. So it's important to note that these tools emerged in the context of, and in many ways were driven by, public sector funding deficiencies. The models themselves are, in a sense, a product of austerity, and the narratives all center on insufficiency of government resources or public funding more generally to meet these objectives. And I'll come back to this when I conclude. If we talk about social impact finance, what we're talking about is the provision of finance with the explicit expectation of a measurable social return as well as a financial return. And measurable is key. In these discussions, it's important to differentiate between those investments that support enterprises that can generate financial returns to repay investors. And then on the other hand, we have those where the end repayer is government or NGOs. So the things mentioned in the report, like green bonds, social bonds, for example, these often have built-in revenue sources to repay investors. And they fund social enterprises, they're engaging in market activity, a surplus is generated to repay investors, perhaps supported by public or philanthropic funds, but they have a basis of financial revenues to repay investors. Traditionally, this has a long track record of support. Internal financing, debt lending, equity financing, hybrid models, these all have been supported over time to support mission-based investing on the investor side, as well as economically targeted investments, microfinance, community bonds. These are not new, they've been around for a long time. And I would suggest these are the areas where the risk mitigation tools that we were just talking about, blended finance, for example, has the strongest logical application. Other forms, however, particularly the pay for success models, which seem to be the most cutting edge and attracting arguably a disproportionate amount of attention, include things like social impact bonds, development impact bonds, social impact incentives, human capital performance bonds, income sharing agreements. These are all repaid by government at the end. They're only privately financed. And these models, which are attracting the most attention, are, I would argue, the ones we need to be the most cautious about. So there's many claims of these models that they permit the delivery of more programs and services. They're incremental. They fund programs that have a strong potential to be paid back from a social return basis, and in many cases, a fiscal return to the government. They're claimed to increase the quality or the effectiveness or the efficiency of these programs that are being funded. And this really reduces to a privatization logic, that the private sector has the incentive and the motivation, if these agreements are structured properly to leverage this type of innovation that the public sector is claimed not to have. And then finally, these models have broader system benefits, the proponents claim, where the entire social system, by engaging in these agreements, will adapt results-based models within other elements of their governance. But to really briefly summarize here, there's many questions regarding the evidence of these models, such as impact bonds, when it comes to actually improving outcomes. There's very high transaction costs, they're very complex to negotiate, and the limited data that's out there suggests that the rates of return being paid to investors are well above what governments would pay to borrow conventionally. So we need to be cautious here. And just to conclude, I would suggest we need to take a step back and ask the question for these models, such as impact bonds, are we getting value for money? Because again, at the end of the day, when these projects hit their targets, it is public sources which are paying the investors here. And you don't have that same rationale that you have in the more conventional blended finance models. And I would like to turn our attention to the ILO's definition of social finance compared to the definition of social finance, which I covered, which talks about social finance as an instrument to promote decent work. It's sustainable finance with a social goal, but it includes a broader perspective. It includes cooperative models to credit, savings, insurance, remittances, financial literacy. It's about how do we fund the social programs that have a clear, demonstrable benefit, both from a government perspective when it comes to alleviating social programs and minimizing the burden on the welfare state, but also from a broader developmental perspective. And just to bring it back to where we all started, public banks, I would argue, fit into this social outcome-centered social finance ecosystem. As highlighted by the report, these are mission-based organizations, and they have that expertise, they have that ability to blend social and financial objectives. So if I were to leave with one lesson, is don't get caught up in all the hype with these niche instruments. Look at what the history has told us about how we've developed successfully in various contexts, and continue to focus on that experience. Thank you, Vincenzo.
Well, thank you, Jesse. Yeah, thank you for your insightful reflection. Indeed, I asked this question because I would like to also to add the perspective of new forms of finance and also the perspective of private finance in this regard. And thank you also for shedding light on the potential of these new forms and for the reference to the ILO, obviously. So I don't know if there are further questions for our panelists. So I invite you all from the floor to text in or to write down it in the chat box, or if I don't know if there are full questions from the audience, from our speakers. So that we can go ahead. Otherwise, yeah, I would like also to ask you, in light of what we discussed today. So, how taking into account the situation of many African countries, and let's say the critical debt situation that we have discussed also before with the Ms. Phiri, and in light of also of the recent COVID-19 disruptive impact. Which can be for these countries for such countries the best mechanism to find the appropriate financial resources to start an effective path that will lead then to the achievement of the SDGs. So I ask this question to both of our speakers. Federico, please, if you want to go first.
Well, you're asking the $1 billion question. I think that one needs to start from the recognition of some facts. First of all, COVID pandemic has highlighted a number of vulnerabilities, not only in health systems, systems, but in production systems and in supply chains. And I think that here we are discussing about financing tools and instruments, but we should always remember that financing is a means to an end. And we need to recast the international and national discussions about what are the priorities for investment. And I think that the crisis has clearly shown to us that investing in the resilience of health systems, but also investing in productive capabilities of developing countries is fundamental. And I am old enough to remember that the need of having an industrial policy or investing in industry, manufacturing, has not always been the flavor of the month, to put it mildly. And so I think that it's important to recognize that there's nothing wrong, actually, it's quite right to support developing countries in their strategic agenda for industrialization, something that OECD countries are doing themselves. So first of all, where do we put the money? Let's learn the lesson from the COVID crisis. Health systems and industrial systems are paramount, and the pharma medical complex can actually be a very important target for killing two birds with one stone to some extent, because it helps addressing the vulnerability of health systems, but it also can be a source of employment and upgrading of systems. Second, we should not forget the elephant in the room. And I use the word elephant for two reasons. One, because of the figure of speech, so climate change, but also because when we think about what are the assets that can be invested in, we tend to forget that nature assets provide ecosystem services that are often not properly valued. You may be familiar with the literature, including by the IMF now, that tries to estimate what is the real service that, for example, elephants or whales or forests or other nature assets do provide. And when you compare the true value of these assets with the quote unquote price of those assets or that kind of valuation, there is a clear disconnect. So if those assets and the services that they're providing were adequately valued, there will be incentives for farmers or citizens in many developing countries to invest in the protection of those assets and receive financing for the fact that they are protecting those assets that are, for example, storing CO2 or assets that are providing vital ecosystem services. So here is an area for financial innovation that needs to be explored more carefully. And last but not least, since we are talking about climate and there is the interaction between climate and debt, many LDCs and many small island development states are trapped into something that in French you would call la double peine. You have two traps. One is that you are highly not being responsible for emissions, and on the other hand, your GDP collapses after typhoon, hurricanes, and your capacity to repay debt goes down. So there is here a very important conversation about the relationship between the macro financial risk related to climate change and debt sustainability. And we're rethinking some of the debt sustainability assumptions that we have in our debt sustainability analysis and looking at how this can be better taken into account. Finally, on this, because we were mentioning the special drawing rights before, and of course, this is a very complex question because special drawing rights are by some countries considered not as a source of liquidity to invest into recovery, but rather to ensure stability and avoid balance of payments crisis. Well, there are proposals that are being made, for example, by Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, and her economic advisor, Avinash Persaud, for a permanent issuance of SDR to support the transformation and the transition to withstand climate change. If you think about the magnitude of the change that we are confronted with, this is not going to happen simply through market-based systems. There is a huge need for public investment that would show the way and catalyze and channel private resources into transformational investments. And developing countries that are already confronted with a squeeze in their finances and high debt will need to find somewhere the resources to invest into this huge problem that we are all confronted with. So I don't know whether I did answer your question, Vincenzo, but I tried to share some ideas about what I think is important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. For sure, you answered my question, and also thank you for this all-embracing, let's say, reflection on different aspects. Especially, I very appreciate that on the natural assets too. That too much is neglected in this respect. So I'm going to ask the same question to Jesse before giving the floor to Daniele, as time is running up.
Thank you, Vincenzo, for the question. I'll first speak to the issue of COVID-19 and what we've learned from government responses to that crisis, and then I'll speak to the case of Africa. COVID-19, no doubt, was a crisis of unprecedented magnitude, and we saw an equally unprecedented response from governments across the globe. In the advanced developed countries, we saw unorthodox monetary and fiscal policy measures of a scale that we've just never seen before. And these measures clearly go counter to the narrative of fiscal constraints and austerity that have been more typical of the previous 40-year period. When the crisis was there was no question that central banks needed to not only reduce interest rates significantly, but engage in unorthodox monetary quantitative easing and generating the credit and resources needed to rescue the economy from the pandemic. So again, I would go back to this big picture question. Are we doing all we can on the public side when it comes to mobilizing resources for development and promoting progressive fiscal policies as well to reduce inequality? If we look at the consequence, the economic consequence of the pandemic in an advanced country like Canada, for example, 2 years in, we've seen income inequality be reduced. We've seen jobs fully recover, and we've seen the highest real wage gains taking place for low-income earners that we've seen in decades. And this is all because of this more conventional, proactive governmental approach to addressing these social problems. So what does this tell us about what we can do in Africa, for example? Well, I think from an international development perspective, it really gives us the foundation to question this assumption, this premise that public funding is simply not available for this. Sure, it's not available from a political commitment perspective, but it's not a technical restraint. So let's not pretend it is. In the African context, we also need to address the elephant in the room of capital flight. We speak to the need to bring private investment to the continent, and there's certainly a logic to that. But as UNDP research has shown us, that for every dollar that the LDCs receive in foreign aid, a good proportion of that leaves in illicit capital flows, with many countries having ratios well in excess of that, in cases sometimes 16 to 1. So we do need to address that there are these structural challenges. There's these historic inequities that raise skepticism, and I think well-founded skepticism about efforts on behalf of the advanced developed countries to promote this private financing model. It's important to remember in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, it was not an uncontested notion that there should be this huge emphasis on private finance. The G77 lobbied for measures to increase both domestic resource mobilization to, for example, combat tax evasion, to limit capital flight, to restructure debt, and put a greater emphasis on public financing and public funding. And ultimately, those efforts did not succeed. But I think those efforts should not be put aside at this point, and we need to continue to respect the divergence opinions on the validity of emphasizing a private finance approach to addressing these pressing social needs.
Well, great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you for this reflection and also for seeing different perspective in this regard. So before ending this second panel and giving the floor to Daniele, just would like to ask you the last question that comes from the attendees. So should development banks follow different risk analysis rules and procedures than commercial and investment banks when considering private sector projects with positive social and environmental impact? Maybe Federico, if you want to answer first, and then we can give the floor to Jesse.
My answer is that I don't know. I would suggest that I would answer in two ways. First of all, that there is a need for proper risk assessment. When we engage with African leaders, one of the most frequent complaint that we hear is that there is a misperception of risks in African countries, and this misperception leads to mispricing of risk, and therefore African sovereigns and private borrowers are confronted with higher borrowing costs than others. So for sure, there is a need here for ensuring that there is a clear assessment of risks related to different countries. This is not answering entirely the question that was asked, but I think it's important to remind you that we need to have proper risk assessment tools, but that those risk assessment tools need to go a bit more granular, and sometimes there is little information available about opportunities. So my point before about having clear investment strategies and signaling from governments in terms of where the priorities are going to be, and stability of regulatory framework is important. The second point is whether there should be differentiated metrics to incentivize investment in processes that have social returns that are higher than market returns. Well, I think that to some extent, this is what Jesse was suggesting, that there is a market there for returns that are financially right and socially right, that is maybe undertapped. So whether the use of different risk assessment tools is the way to go, I will not be able to answer, but there is clearly an untapped set of opportunities, and a reflection is certainly important on what tools could be best address those. So my answer is a maybe.
Yes, please, Jesse.
I would have a similarly conditional answer, in the sense that when you're defining what we mean by rules and procedures, are we broadening out to the broader policies? I think we'd all agree that concessional finance certainly makes sense in this context, because that is the mandate of these organizations, of the public development banks, is to promote both a social and financial prerogative. So yeah, then the answer is yes. I do certainly think there is a role here for reducing risk. Again, you can define risk in so many different ways, but if the risk is tied to this uncertainty, this unfamiliarity with the context, then by all means, help break down that barrier of knowledge. And again, when leveraging private finance, if we are talking about socially motivated investors, and when we're talking about social finance, we're talking about providing finance to the social and solidarity economy. There's certainly a role here for describing how the risk may not be as profound as investors may believe where they're starting from. The classic example is the success and failure rates of co-ops. You have traditional financial institutions being perhaps hesitant to lend to cooperatives, but the data shows that cooperatives are actually less risky than your conventional business model when it comes to business failure rates. So all these forms of risk and the ability to convey additional knowledge, alleviate concerns when it comes to this scope I'm describing for what I think is the proper sphere for this discussion around social finance to happen, certainly a role.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you also for your answer, your consideration in this respect. Well, I think that it is time to conclude this second panel. So just let me say thank you all for this opportunity. Thank you, Jesse and Federico, for this opportunity to share knowledge together and to learn from your intervention. So, and finally, thanks to EII for having us here today. So it was a very pleasure and a great opportunity for all of us. And I'm giving the floor to Daniele.
Thank you, Vincenzo. Thank you all for this, keeping 100 people connected for 2.5 hours on sometimes very technical topics is a challenge, but we made it. So I'm very happy for that, because it means that the quality of the panelists we mobilized was appreciated, and I appreciate also the quality of this last panel, because it raised so many issues that are at stake. Federico mentioned the importance of prioritization that goes even before investments mobilization, the importance of building partnership. PPPs or blended finance is still limited and highly concentrated, especially in developing countries in particular sectors. So it is important to widen the scope of this. This requires the need to address structural challenges. So to work on capacity building and to risk assessment and to support governments in this endeavor. And metrics can play a key role in this, because as Jesse said, we need to convince private sectors and investors that even sectors that are traditionally considered as risky, like cooperatives, as he mentioned, can actually be less risky than others. So I really appreciated the stress that both the speakers made on the importance of the public sector in this, not only because they provide long-term planning and long-term investments with their activities, but also because they provide the scrutiny for private actors to play in this market. And when we're speaking about social impacts and solidarity, I think this is crucial, because prioritization of sustainable finance can actually delegitimize public actors to play the role that they are asked to play. So I'm very happy for having listened to this wonderful presentations in this second panel. Let me thank again the Compagnia San Paolo Foundation for supporting us in this project, and the International Training Center of the ILO for being with us since September last year in designing and then implementing this workshop. Again, thanks to Nicoletta and my colleagues from EI for making this possible. And finally, to the colleagues of the European Think Tanks Group. I think 2022 is a crucial year, and we have several challenges ahead of us. Sustainable finance is a very hot and trendy topic now, but it needs to be accompanied by deep analysis and assessment of the challenges and also the opportunities that it brings forward. So we as research community have this task, and we'll be happy to accompany you with future events and projects on this topic and to foster the debate on a global basis. So from my side, thank you very much again, and I hope I can virtually or at some point, hopefully physically meet you in our events. Thanks again, and have a nice afternoon and evening or morning in case of Jesse.